Hello, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World Talks. NATO Secretary General is extremely optimistic about the future of the North Atlantic Alliance. Mark Rutte said on Tuesday that he considers the allies' commitments to increase defense spending to be of key importance. And to discuss the future of NATO, we're joined by Shea, a diplomat and a former NATO official, currently senior fellow at Friends of Europe. Good evening.
Good evening to you too.
So first of all, I'd like to ask you about one of the hottest topics in this very corner of the world. What do you think about the possibility of German troops to be withdrawn from Germany to be relocated to Poland?
Well, President Trump has not ruled out this idea, which I think is positive when it was mentioned by Poland's defense minister. And indeed, of course, it would be much better for the United States and for NATO if those troops could be simply relocated to another country. And indeed, in the case of Poland, those American troops would be joining the American forces already in Poland and in the Baltic states and closer to the front line with Russia. So this could even be a plus for NATO. Moreover, if the troops move to another NATO country in Europe like Poland, the cost of relocating those troops will be massively cheaper for the United States than the expense of having to move them all the way across the Atlantic and build new bases for them back in the United States itself. So let's hope that President Trump is open to these ideas, and maybe at the forthcoming NATO summit in Ankara in July, a deal along those lines could be struck. I think this would make sense for everybody concerned, and of course would be in line with the NATO strategy of reinforcing its presence on its eastern borders in countries like Poland, Romania, the Baltic states and Finland.
You say that if not Poland or the eastern flank of NATO, the 5,000 American soldiers would be relocated back to the US. But is this the American perspective, or are they rather to be sent somewhere to the region of Pacific?
Well, we don't know is the answer, and the Pentagon has not made that clear so far. And of course, what is worrying, I think, for NATO is that the United States seems to be wanting to take out an entire combat brigade, which means that not only would the 5,000 troops go, but also their heavy equipment, which is so important, of course, because troops can't fight without equipment. And so I hope that at the very least, if the troops are moved, some of that equipment can stay in Europe in special storage sites, which was the practice during the Cold War, which then makes it much quicker for the troops to return in a crisis situation. But I think there's another big issue that really NATO has to put to the United States, which is that at the NATO summit in Washington, just over a year ago, nearly 2 years ago now, the United States, along with the other allies, agreed to new regional defense plans. And the United States took on very specific commitments to have the forces in Europe and the reinforcement forces ready so that the United States could defend its part of NATO territory. And of course, the consequence of withdrawing troops from Europe may mean that the United States is not able to meet those commitments anymore, or needs to meet those commitments in a different way. So I think this is where clarity is urgently needed in the alliance. But at the moment we don't have that clarity, nor do we know if the US is planning further troop reductions in Europe, either in Germany or Italy or Spain or elsewhere, as President Trump has indicated. But of course the details are what really matter if you're a NATO planner.
Right, so you mentioned the relocation of US troops in the context of the upcoming NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey. What else should we expect from this meeting?
Well, I think obviously the Europeans will not want to see the transatlantic rift deepen further. There are signs, for example, of progress when it comes to the Greenland dispute, with Denmark and the United States talking about the building of 3 new American bases in southern Greenland, which hopefully would go some way to assuaging President Trump's concern about the defense of Greenland. We have good signs, of course, on European defence spending, which is now rising rapidly, as the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte pointed out in his recent annual report, up by $125 billion last year alone. President Trump should be pleased with that as Europeans take on more responsibility. And hopefully by the time we get to Ankara, there will be more transatlantic harmony on Iran, with the Europeans supporting negotiations between the United States and Iran on the nuclear file and offering to help out as they did in the past, and with a European-led force perhaps deploying in the Strait of Hormuz as part of international efforts to keep that strait open and returning to normal commercial navigation. That, at least, I think, is the agenda that NATO planners would hope for. Whether it will happen is a different question, of course, but it's not by any means impossible.
Ukraine has signed a major drone production deal with Germany yesterday, and it is about to close a similar deal with the US pretty soon. How is this shaping the modern NATO policy?
Well, it's extremely important, of course, because Ukraine has the technology, the innovation capacity, the data, because, of course, it's involved in a live conflict. It's learning things every day. It's adjusting very quickly. NATO does not have military units which include private sector employees. But Ukraine has precisely those units because it's learned the importance of having real-time adaptation, particularly of the software of drones. But on the other hand, Ukraine lacks the finance, it lacks the production capability, the big industries that can produce at scale, because as we've discovered, not just in Ukraine, but also in the war in the Persian Gulf, you use drones up very, very, very quickly indeed in modern combat, and you need therefore to be able to produce them at scale. And it's precisely countries like Germany and the United States, but also like the Netherlands, Norway and Denmark, with which Ukraine also has now got drone agreements that have that capacity to scale up quickly. So that is basically the partnership which seems to be emerging, and it will obviously be good for Ukraine in getting the supplies that it needs, but it will also be good for NATO in being able to learn from Ukraine's battlefield experience and how it needs to adapt its own force posture to account for the reality of modern drone warfare.
Is then Ukraine an asset to NATO these days?
Well, absolutely. First of all, because it's acquiring that modern battlefield experience, which is so useful for NATO, so that it can adapt in peacetime. Because adapting in peacetime is going to put NATO in a much stronger position than waiting for a war to break out, making all of the mistakes, realizing weaknesses and gaps and failures, losing territory to Russia, and then having to adjust painfully thereafter. So get it right as part of deterrence, and you won't need to use it for war fighting. But the second thing that Ukraine is doing is massively depleting the strength of the Russian army. Russia is no longer acquiring significant territory in Ukraine. March and April were months where the Ukrainians actually captured more territory from Russia than they lost. And of course, the Russians are taking enormous battlefield losses, including with equipment. And that depletion of the Russian army, the weakening of the Russian army, of course, gives NATO more time to adjust and adapt, to be prepared to face potentially the Russia of the future as well. And finally, Ukraine, which is integrated into NATO in the future, will be the best army in NATO when it comes to battlefield experience, a massive addition to NATO's own posture, and will make the defensive task of countries like Poland or Finland, the Baltic states, other NATO members on the eastern flank, massively better than if, of course, Ukraine is reintegrated into the Russian Empire and you have Russian troops on the Polish border in the next 4 or 5 years.
But then the question remains whether Ukraine will really join NATO and whether there's enough political will within NATO to invite Ukraine into the alliance.
That's true, but the opposition, to be frank, has been mainly from the United States, and that could change. The administration we have at the moment is not going to be there forever, so we'll see. And NATO, and of course, the integration of Ukraine into NATO is a long experience, but there are different ways of joining NATO. Yes, of course, you could sign the treaty, get the security guarantee, and then begin the process of integration into NATO, achieving operability, joint exercises, joint stationing of forces, joint defense defence plans, or you can do it the other way. And what we're seeing at the moment, with the prospect of European troops being deployed in Ukraine in the future to implement a ceasefire, with these drone cooperation agreements, these coalitions that you've just been describing, with the way in which NATO and Ukrainian air defence are being integrated step by step as well, with Ukraine achieving NATO standards in its procurement and its equipment, that the integration of Ukraine in NATO is taking place step by step, well before the actual de jure moment of the signing of a treaty would take place. And of course, as long as the EU is also moving forward with Ukraine's membership of the EU, and also is becoming a defence union at the same time, and is now funding Ukraine's defence with the new €90 billion EU loan, then that integration of Ukraine into Euro-Atlantic defence structures is taking place on the EU track as well as on the NATO track.
In this context, what do you make of Vladimir Putin's recent remarks on opening new peace talks with Europe on Ukraine?
Well, it's, I think, important for Europe to have a voice at the table, because obviously European security, more than the security of the continental United States, is most at stake from the future shape of an agreement. Where we come out in Ukraine will determine whether NATO is safer or less safe over the next decade. So I think it's important that Europe has a voice at the table. I don't think that Gerhard Schröder, who clearly would be on the Russian side of the table as much as the European side of the table, is the right man for that particular job. But if Russia is open to the idea of at least having a European envoy who has credibility, though, of course, also on the European side in standing up to Russia, that could be a positive thing. But of course, it has to be coordinated with the track that President Trump has opened with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who I understand are going to be going back to Moscow soon to talk to Vladimir Putin. So we mustn't have sort of two competing sort of sets of peace negotiations, but simply a greater European voice at the table.
James Shea, diplomat and former NATO official, senior fellow at Friends of Europe currently. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
A pleasure for me too. Thank you.
And thank you for watching and stay with us for more interviews here on TVP World.